Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the British Institute at Ankara. I'm David Logan, I'm the chairman. I was looking at the flyer about this evening, about David Barchard, our distinguished speaker. It's really pretty modest and rather uninformative. It says he's worked in Turkey, he's written on Turkish relations with Europe, completing a book. I mean, he is a very distinguished expert on Turkey. He's lived there for many years, he's a fluent Turkish speaker, and he was a very distinguished correspondent for The Economist in Turkey. And as far as this evening is concerned, he's written a number of academic articles on the subject of Crete, Ottoman Crete, including one on religion and violence in Ottoman Crete, which makes him a great authority on the subject. I think I'm right in saying you're completing a book at the moment, David, aren't you, on Ottoman-Western relations in the 19th century? Yes. Not quite century, yeah. And so, as I say, when you read this, you wouldn't think all that, but as I say, we're fortunate to have David here. He'll talk for, I don't know, about 3/4 of an hour, let's say, something like that. A little bit more than that, and then he's kindly agreed to take some questions as well. Thanks so much.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be talking to the Institute. My dealings with it go back to the time of Michael Goff, with whom I stayed at Allahan a long time ago. I've known it over the years. And actually, this particular audience, I've known an awful lot of people here, so thank you very much for coming, particularly Professor Robert Holland, who doubtless will be jumping up and down every time he spots me making a mistake on this topic, which he knows far better than I do. Because as most of you know, I'm really a specialist on present-day Turkey and what's happening there at the moment. And all this study of the 19th century is slightly done with the left hand. I hope it's scholarly. It is based on contemporary sources, particularly the British archives, but also work in other languages, including even a little Greek. I can't pretend to be much of a Greek speaker. And I'm not going to, although this seems to be a very long talk this evening, I'm not going to talk about every aspect of the immensely intricate and convoluted conflict in Crete between 1896 and 1898, which is really extraordinarily over-fertile in detail and rather difficult to remain on top of. That's partly explained by the geography. We'll come to the moment. The first slide. You haven't heard of the Cretan Problem because it was solved in 1898, 1899, and given a few settlements afterwards, culminating in the annexation of Crete by Greece in 1912, in October 1912, on the eve of the Balkan Wars. It vanished from the international radar. Though occasionally, apparently, you do see signs on walls in Crete calling for independence for the Cretans. I think it's largely a joke. In the 19th century, it was a major issue. Crete is a strategically crucial island dominating the Eastern Mediterranean, and it's got you can't really see on that map, so I'll show you later, a deep water port, which is the best in the Eastern Mediterranean, and could perhaps have been the equivalent of Malta for Russia, if it had got down into the Eastern Mediterranean early in the century. Wellington, therefore, insisted in 1829, when Greece became independent, that it remained in the Ottoman Empire and didn't go to the new Kingdom of Greece. This was controversial. He was partly dominated by fear of piracy, which happened in the island of Garabusa, at the northeast end of the island, but I think his fear of what happened to Suda Bay is the main reason. I say that, it's a little difficult to document it, though the French in particular are very much conscious of that. It had a mixed population. I say mixed, it wasn't really ethnically mixed. The population was Greek-speaking, they were obviously closely related to each other, but they were separated by religion. This is a clash of civilizations, not of peoples, not of races, not of languages. And it's a story of disaster for the smaller of the two groups. Around about 1921, when Greece revolted against Turkey, the Turkish or the Muslim population, and excuse me this evening, I shall be talking about Muslims and Christians, because that's what people talked about then. They're both, in some sense, Greek, but I'm going to call them what people in the archive records call them. The number of Christians was probably around 55%, but the disaster of the War of Independence in Crete caused that to fall rapidly. as did Ottoman policy subsequently, which was designed to placate the Greeks. You won't easily realize that if you read the standard version of Christian Greek history of the 19th century, because it stresses the cruelties and executions and tyrannies of the Turks. But in fact, the practical effect of Ottoman economic policy under Giritli Mustafa Naili Pasha, who was governor from the 1820s until 1851, was to favour the Christians, just at a time when their population numbers were rising. From before the Greek War of Independence, there had always been the aspiration of independence. And these took the form of historic uprisings in each decade. They weren't successful because, I think, for a number of reasons, one of which is that union with Crete, that it was important for the mainland Greeks, wasn't their highest priority. Another was that these were a hangover from the past. Exactly similar incidents had happened during the Venetian rule in Crete, and the Venetians had coped with this by building enormous walls, which sadly are destroyed now. But what would happen was that the minority population, first Venetian, later Muslim, would flood down from the towns and farms in the lowlands into the cities and remain there for as long as the war continued. And that might be several years, 2 or 3 years in some cases. And one such rising happened every decade. What we're talking about this evening is the last of these, the siege, which began in the summer of 1896, accelerated in the beginning of 1897, and went on to 1899. The third and final point to mention about this is that we're talking about a situation, an international conflict, in which there is no great power rivalry. It was decided at the beginning of the century, the French, and no doubt the Russians, had aspirations. There was talk of a French colony of 500,000 people. By the time that the last crisis happened, it was definite the island would go to Greece. So this is a very unusual international conflict in that it's a peacekeeping operation by outside powers, none of whom has a substantial advantage to gain over the others. Let's look quickly at the Muslim minorities. They're almost all Greek speakers. Commander Spratt in the 1850s, when he was doing the survey to lay the telegram, although he was actually rather in favour of them, describes them as perverts, which is a little unkind. But they were regarded as people, they were certainly regarded as apostates, and this is part of their problem with Europe. They'd been converted after the 1669 conquest of Crete, and they remained a ruling class, a privileged class, until about 1856, and the Hatti Humayun of that year, which restored all sorts of privileges to them and incidentally allowed crypto-Christians to leave their Muslim identity behind them and become Christians again. They are settled unevenly across the island. It's relevant to point out that the strongest concentration, approaching nearly 40% in some districts, is in the centre of the island, at the town, around the town, which is today known as Heraklion, and was then known to the Ottomans and to the internationally as Candia. In fact, the island is being called after that. It wasn't then the capital. These Muslims are mostly heterodox. They're Bektashis. They're Bektashis because they're descendants of Janissaries. And all of them, even to this day, retain some kind of memory of an original Bektashi ancestor who came from Turkey. Family I'm talking about at various points this evening, the Kara Hasanakis of Daphnia, believe themselves to be descended from someone who'd come from Trabzon. When a blood test was done on a member of that family, who is personally known to me, it revealed predominantly Italian and Spanish haplogroups. If you read Molly Green's book, A Shared World, you'll see that after the Ottoman conquest of Crete, there was a substantial amount of conversion of Venetians. I'll say no more than that, but they're mixed in, and their native language is Greek. Their political loyalty is to Istanbul. They depend on the Ottoman government for protection, and they're very fearful, rightly fearful, of what would happen to them if that protection was removed. And that is part of the story of why there are no Muslims left on Crete today. On top of that, Crete is a very poor society and a very violent one. If you look at various volumes of translated Greek poems of the early 19th century, you'll find endless accounts of battles in folk songs, rather similar to the sort of tragic tutus you get in central Anatolia. And sometimes the people in them, who are clearly no different from their neighbours and are regarded as heroic, are actually, in the 1820s at least, Muslims, not Christians. Oh, sorry, that's it's a catastrophe. Yeah. Right. Britain, of course, is the one superpower of the 19th century, and it's the arbiter of what happens in Crete. It isn't as powerful as America is today, and it doesn't have the kind of organization behind it that we have in NATO. In fact, at this period, the ententes with Russia and France are several years in the future, 1904 and 1907. It had early supported the transfer of Crete to Greece. In the 1860s, there had been a 3-year war, and Stanley, who was the Foreign Secretary, was almost made up his mind to allow the transfer to happen. I think the probable reason why it didn't happen is that until a fairly late date in the 19th century, British policy was very fearful of Russia, and it was very fearful of the possibility that Greece, being an Orthodox country, would be taken over by Russia. The Greeks used to hate this sometimes in things they wrote to the British. You know, if you don't protect us, others may take us over. Again, I'm being a little conjectural saying that, but I suspect that's the motivation. Britain, however, did not want to become too deeply involved in what it could see was a very conflicted and likely to be a short-term in 1878, when Britain had as compensation, that's 18th century diplomatic term, to take a bit of Ottoman territory. They examined Crete and decided it was just too dangerous. There's bound to be another civil war there. The Greeks demanded it. They would be embroiling themselves in conflict. And when in the 1890s, Biliotti, about whom we're talking this evening, was asked by the people to, Muslims that is, to see if Britain could accept Crete as a protectorate. He was quite enthusiastic, but London definitely wasn't. And there's a big shift in attitudes over the decades. In 1856, round about then, under Consul Dixon, the Britons on the island essentially beginning to see it as a Greek island suffering anomalous Turkish rule, rather than an island which is simply part of the Turkish Empire. I mentioned a bit of the safety in the cities already. There's Canea, which is the capital of the 19th century. There's Retimo, Candia, Iraklion today. And finally, there's a much weaker situation here, a much smaller city, Sitia, relevant to our story. This ended, around here, as I said, you've got large numbers of Muslims, quite a lot around here, very few in the mountains, particularly in Sfakia. Here, about 4,000 in the eastern side of the island, and on this side, you've got Hieropetra. In the 19th century, all these places are widely separated from each other and only accessible by sea. In 1856, Veli Pasha, the liberal Ottoman governor, had tried to build a coastal road, and it's one of the reasons why the Greeks rose up. You went by steamboat, and it took you quite a few hours. You'll see that in our talk at one point, Biliotti goes from Candia, and I think it takes him 5 or 6 hours. So he arrives back very late in the day. Nowadays, you do it in about 2 hours. Well, you do the whole island in about 2 hours. I think it's remarkably fast. Come back again to the question of the sieges. What happens in them? Well, they happen so often, once every 10 years, that the people involved know each other. And when the Muslims come down from the countryside, they actually take the keys and take over the houses of known Greeks. And it's not a timeshare arrangement, but it's a fairly formal arrangement. This is well documented by Biliotti. It's precisely the sort of thing he was interested in. He would go and find out, and he would write a dispatch. And that's one of the things that makes it very different from most consular reporters. Once they're in the town walls, the siege lasts several years and under appalling conditions which passed largely unnoticed all the way through to 1898. You have observers like Stillman, American, in Crete in the 1860s, 1870s, living in Candia when the Ottoman government is there, completely oblivious of the hardship of all the Muslim peoples around him. It's quite extraordinary, because you're looking at the Ottoman documents and looking at what these people try to tell the rest of the world, it's obvious that they are on the verge of starvation. Even in the 1820s, a substantial number of them had actually died, altering the demographic balance on the island. Exile and disruption reinforced the sense of political identity on both sides, particularly for those Greeks who went to Athens, because there they learn about Greek nationalism and they return radicalized, even though they made a temporary bargain with the Ottoman authorities. One of the major features of all these attacks, and one of the underlying rationales of the way the island works, is the olives. And in all these things, in all these uprisings, the Christians usually attack the olive trees. And you can tell how serious the uprising is from the level where they do that. Do they just saw off branches? Do they cut the trunk? Or do they, as they did in 1896, 1897, dig up the olive tree, burn it out, and ensure it can't grow again? The village of Daphne in the Far East, which I mentioned, in 1896 was olive growing. When I visited it, I didn't notice any olives. It seems to be predominantly a wine-growing region today. There's also a time element to this. The olive season starts in the late autumn and it finishes in January. When there are these decennial uprisings, they almost always start in January. That's the time when people have money and time on their hands and they don't have to worry about their living. Another feature of the Ottoman cultivation business is that 1 in 3 harvests is bad. So from the point of view of an Ottoman Cretan, you have to find someone who's going to buy your crops, call him müşteri, which means customer in Turkish, and he has to be willing to give you credit during the 3rd bad year when you will have little or no income. And this enables a transfer of land ownership in the 19th century away from the Muslim beys towards Greek moneylenders and people of that sort, a particular one being someone called Symmachus Karakorino, who you'll hear again later, who is an Ionian who arrives in the island in the 1860s, becomes a British citizen in 1871 at the same time as Biliotti, and comes to a sudden end on the 6th of September 1898, when his Muslim neighbours burned him alive. Let's look quickly at Biliotti, the 2nd generation Italian. As you probably know, the Napoleonic Wars severed the traditional commercial links between the and the West, trade policies and communities which went right back to the 16th century in Crete and in Ankara end. And there's a sort of wave of resettlement at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which gives us families like the Giraud and the Whittles, whom most of you have heard, and also the Biliottis. His father was born in Livorno in 1802 and was a merchant. But you could usually combine that in the early years, but not in the later 19th century, by being a diplomat representing an embassy as well. And his father entered the British service, and Alfred followed him as a translator. It's a matter of speculation where he was educated. I suspect the Christian Brothers School in Izmir, but I'm not sure. He also got an informal but important education from the British archaeologist Charles Newton, who arrived in Rhodes in the 1850s and who used Biliotti as a sort of amanuensis, travelling with him and George Finlay and later with Miller around, training him as an archaeologist, so that eventually Biliotti could conduct important excavations on his own and do very well. Despite that, he never spoke English absolutely correctly. He spoke French at home, later because his wife was French, but he had a very firm mind, was an exceptionally good and inquisitive consular reporter, and they're still valuable today in disciplines like anthropology, economics, history, and of course archaeology. In fact, they form one of the main planks of one of the best books written on Turkey, Michael Mika's account of the community in Off on the Black Sea, a distinguished work of anthropology. He spent most of his early life in Trabzon, which he hated, managed to avoid being sent to Diyarbakir. He pressed Lord Salisbury, with whom he appears to have established some sort of direct relationship in the 1870s to give him the consulship in Canea, which was a great prize because it was better paid than most places, including places which on the face of it might be more important. He arrived at the end of a little golden age in Crete. In 1868, after 3 years of warfare, the Ottomans had pacified Crete. Ali Pasha, the great Ottoman Sadrazam Grand Vizier, had given it a constitution known as the Organic Law, and which contained an assembly. Less unpleasantly, he had also created a network of fortresses across the island known as blockhouses, where you would keep up to one company, and these maintained an iron grip on the island. There's so many of those blockhouses are still there in the countryside. They're usually about 3 stories high above a bunker, and they enable the Ottomans to carry on dominating the countryside. Biliotti arrived as the clouds were starting to gather in Crete. One of his earliest dispatches is about the prospect that the Muslims will eventually be driven out of the island. Biliotti, in fact, even since his days with Newton, had been expecting the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the partition of the empire to happen almost hourly, as did everyone else. You've got to bear in mind that all the political arrangements we're talking about today are seen as preliminaries to an eventual breakup and eviction of the Ottoman Turks. There was, in fact, a very clumsy uprising in 1889, when to a considerable extent the Ottomans still had, remember now we're into the 13th year of Abdul Hamid's reign, the powers nevertheless mostly supported the Ottomans. And after a certain amount of fighting of the usual sort and the usual features, swearing of oaths, mutilations, evictions, burnings, desecration of churches. One of the things that Biliotti spotted was that churches were desecrated in order to get the relics out of them. They were regarded as charms which gave the soldiers, let's say Muslim soldiers, freebooters, power. And so you took it, it gave you a certain amount of immunity, but like a battery, it would run out, and then you would have to go into another church and break up another altar stone to get some more relics. In November 1889, Abdul Hamid II abandoned the Pact of Halakha. That's the second law, which in 1878 which granted additional powers to the Cretans and enabled them to have, over a decade, of consensus. Local violence, always very strong in Crete, was growing worse, and Abdul Hamid decided to ignore Christian opinion, and the result was that the Christian community of the island refused to work fully with the Ottomans. These are the preliminaries to the situation which happens later. How did Biliotti work? This guy is the bad guy let's talk. He's a clergyman, close friend of Gladstone called McCall. Come to him in a moment. All the British consuls in the Ottoman Empire had to contend with pro-Christian, pro-nationalist lobbies in Britain, led by Mr. McCall and others. In 1876, McCall and Dean Liddon of St. Paul's had ridden on a boat down the border between Serbia and the Ottoman Empire and said they'd seen a man impaled on a stick. Doesn't seem to have been the case, and British diplomats didn't believe it. And they started an enormous controversy, which is one of the contributors to the Bulgarian agitation of late 1876, which Gladstone made his famous speeches about the evils of the Turks. Well, it has never been written in any of the books about it, but I can tell you from reading the documents that McCall claimed personally to have organised this, and what is more, Queen Victoria at least believed him. So someone like Biliotti, trying to hold the ring between Christians and Muslims, has to face a lot of risk of being attacked in the British press. It's not a theoretical risk, it actually happened to him. And throughout the crisis of the 1896 to 98, both him and the Admiral Sir Robert Harris, the British Admiral Commander on the island, faced constant hate mail, which they found rather inappropriate for Christians. Harris describes it in his memoirs. Biliotti responds to this by being a born networker. He's very conscious of the need to make allies. sorry, it's not. Yes, there we are. Gerard Noel is a senior Victorian admiral who was eventually to be commander in Crete and then go on to a further career in the Royal Navy. He visits Crete in 1894. Biliotti strikes up a correspondence with him, which still survives in the Admiralty archives at Greenwich, and they're two friends. So when the man arrives as governor, 6 or 7 years later, Biliotti is able to draw on an important existing friendship, and it is important. It gets him off a serious hook later in his career when he's in great difficulties. And he deals with people like Sir Herbert Chermside, a Victorian officer who had been Her Majesty's consul in Kurdistan, which was not a governmental expression, and is one of the most senior British soldiers in the Ottoman Empire, and who arrives in Crete at the end of 1896, helping to deal with relief work and end the conflicts which have now become endemic between the two populations. He's also very good at dealing with the newspapers. He hated journalists. In his letters to Sir Gerard Noel, he goes on and names all the most famous journalists who came through, J.D. Boutier, David Hogarth, and so forth, and says they've all let him down. They haven't taken the British enough line. Yet, all of those people supposed him to be their friend, and he spent a good deal of time briefing them, rather as a modern diplomat would do. The story is told of how he used to stand talking to J.D. Boutier, a very famous Times correspondent. Boutier had been a master at Eton, taken up journalism late, was very deaf. Biliotti was also very deaf. So the two men would shout loudly at each other, exchanging information. And meanwhile, in the road outside, the other journalists would be crouched, listening to the briefing that was being given away. Anyhow, the result is that Biliotti conceals his hatred of the press pretty well and is mentioned favourably in most of the books published about Crete. He isn't mentioned favourably by McCall, however. He has to deal with the other consuls. As soon as the Cretan crisis emerges in May 1896, the consuls form a sort of corps, and this is part of an organisation which I'll describe in a moment, the Concert of Europe. You have a committee of ambassadors in Istanbul, which take major decisions. You have a committee of the Admirals ruling Crete, which is by now considered an independent island, and you have the other consuls. Biliotti's problem here is that because he's been representing the superpower, and he speaks English, or at least his work goes out in English, the other consuls hate him, including his own brother-in-law, the French consul, who is the brother of his wife Marguerite. And if you read the French documents, time and time again, they say unfavourable things about Biliotti, getting above his boots, needing to be silenced, behaving extraordinarily, or if he does something good, they simply don't admit it. The other consuls also are much less proactive than he is. Soon after fighting breaks out in the summer of 1896, Biliotti wants the consul to go on a trip of investigation into the countryside to see what the conflicts are, how they can be dealt with, and how they can be stopped. He gets orders from London telling him that he's not allowed to do this. And the archives say, we have not told Mr. Biliotti that this order has been given because the other consuls and other countries have refused to support him in this endeavour. They're simply less proactive, less brave, and I think, once fair to say, less neutral than he is. However, in 1896, a little unexpectedly, he becomes a KCMG. Quite a big step up for someone like him. He has actually got a CMG and I think a CBE some years earlier. He tends to get them when Lord Salisbury is in power. He doesn't expect it. He writes to Noel saying that he was almost delirious and overjoyed by this thing. Why did Lord Salisbury give him this honour? My assumption is to beef up his position against the other consuls, and possibly also to strengthen his position against Istanbul. Time and time again, you find signs that the junior embassy officials in Constantinople make fun of Biliotti. They underline his mistakes in English on his dispatches. They write nasty things about, even exclamation marks, and occasionally they get someone to take over from him. A young diplomat in about 1894 called Charles Harding, who's in Constantinople, is deputed to write a report on the Cretan economy. And the intention is very clear. It's to upstage Biliotti. Actually, he produces a rather long and boring report. Charles Harding, of course, is destined for great things. He goes on to be permanent Under-Secretary on the eve of the First World War, and he's already a fellow of All Souls College, Oxford. So, I mean, Biliotti is really capable of outperforming quite distinguished people. Now then, this is simply what happened on May the 24th, 1896, when Biliotti sent out this dispatch, fighting in the streets, and the next day, British, Russian, and Austrian ships arrive, followed by the French, and dominate the coastline of northern Crete, particularly Canea, until they depart at the end of 1898, by which time Crete is no longer genuinely in the Ottoman Empire. How had this happened? Well, it began in various stages. First of all, Abdul Hamid ruled the island in a repressive fashion, under repressive governors for most of the first half of the 1890s. It wasn't really possible for there to be an uprising at that stage because in 1893, Greece went bankrupt, which prevented it from being involved. As you know, the Prime Minister of Greece, Kyrillaos Trikoupis, went to the Assembly and said, "Gentlemen, the country is bankrupt," and that paralyzed Greece for several years. But it didn't stop people taking action, including this man who was an early leader of the Greek League. Is Mike McTiernan here? But Mike, I owe you a big debt. Many of these photographs you're going to recognise are from your webpage. And I owe you a particular acknowledgement for finding the portrait of Biliotti, which was completely unknown until you discovered it. Anyhow, so I just thought I'd tell you now. Thank you. Conduras goes up into the mountains, sets up something called the Epitropi, the Committee of the Delegates, a sort of guerrilla movement in the mountains behind Candia. It's very embarrassing for Biliotti, not the sort of thing that's mentioned in his normal dispatches, but he has actually persuaded the Ottoman government to send Conduros to Athens to be educated and pay for his education in the hope of creating a sort of tame Cretan Christian upper class. And this blows up in Biliotti's face when his protege leads a rebellion. It's the beginning of a war that goes right on until the end of 1898. So a few days later, a few months later, you get the siege of Vamos, an important fortress just east of Candia. And on the 24th, you get the message I showed you. The Turks send in Abdullah Pasha, who's a harsh but rather ineffective Pasha. He's been fighting the Armenians in east of Turkey, and is not the man for the job. He makes a serious mistake in creating cordons around the cities, which are to survive for several years, which instead of helping the Muslims on the island, effectively help proceed them. A truce is negotiated towards the end of July, in which Biliotti plays a main part, and this is cited as the reason for his CMG. But most mysteriously, and this doesn't seem to be said anywhere else, but I get this from reading the documents, in August 1896, the blockhouses, which network of fortresses across the island, are evacuated. So the Ottomans send the troops somewhere else. That means they lose control of the countryside. Hardly publicised, but it's a fatal, irreversible movement. It means they would actually have to have a very big military campaign indeed to reconquer the island, and there's no way they're going to do that. At the end of the month, a peace deal is signed in Istanbul, where a few days before the Ottoman bank raid has happened, and there are massive troubles there between the Armenians and their Ottoman Muslim neighbours. The peace deal envisages a set of new arrangements for Crete, international commissions, reform of the judiciary, reform of the gendarmerie, reform of the finances and legal system, and so forth. But the Turks simply do almost nothing. Instead, towards the end of the year, Abdul Hamid sends in someone called Saadettin Pasha, who I have tried to investigate and simply can't find out who he is. He's clearly a military man, he's clearly a nasty man. Biliotti is extremely nervous about him, and he eventually gets Britain and the other powers to insist that Abdul Hamid removes him. At the end of the year, Biliotti's position, which in an island where law and order is now deteriorating, is strengthened by the arrival of Chermside. But other people are now taking an interest in Crete. A leading Greek politician, Romanos Athos, arrives in Crete in the middle of January 1897. He's the head, or one of the main figures, of the Ethniki Eteria, a nationalist association based in the Greek army, which a secret nationalist association based in the Greek army, modelled on the one which had helped organise the ground for the Greek War of Independence. And he's clearly looking for ways to stage a major uprising. Tension rises, violence breaks out in January in Canea and elsewhere. In the towns, the Muslims are in the majority even before the flooding in. The Greeks, in most of these Ottoman cities around the Aegean at that stage, the Christians, were less numerous. So the Christians are the vulnerable people. They're also the people who are best at communicating. On the 27th of January, a set of killings takes place in which Christians die, which is used by the powers as the legitimating factor for their intervention and detachment of Crete from the Ottoman Empire on the grounds that it's violated international law by not observing the 1868 and 1878 treaties. So we'll look at military balance. Basically, you have a huge disparity in favour of the Cretan Christians. You have just under 11,000 Ottoman soldiers on the island, scattered in various forts across the island, mainly, though, in those four coastal cities I showed you, and Hierapetra on the south coast. And you have Christians who were able to field forces almost everywhere. During the later period, the international powers, perhaps because none of them is aiming at conquest, and this is a secondary international issue for them, put in really rather small numbers of people, in particular the British. The smallest number of all is put in by the Germans. They put in 17 men in total because they're really out of this game. Their friends, the Austrians, initially put in more than the British, 677, but they later withdraw. By 1898 and the uprising of the 6th of September, I'm just a little bit repetitive, but since this is new to you, I thought I'd keep throwing these names back. Britain only has 128 soldiers guarding 52,000 people. Just to explain briefly what the Concept of Europe is, as you know, it was founded at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. It looks, in retrospect, like a proto-international organization. It is basically simply a set of contacts between a group of great powers which all agree to do the same thing. This was the way they had tried to impose their wishes on Turkey following 1878 and the Congress of Berlin. It didn't last for many years. You originally have pictures of all the ambassadors sitting around the table taking a decision. But by the 1890s, though that still happens, and it happens over Crete, it's much less common. It isn't a modern international organization. It doesn't have a secretary general, doesn't have a secretariat. And it can only go as fast as all the powers want. Now, during this conflict, Germany stays out totally, and Austria, eventually in 1898, pulls out too. This looks like a gesture of disapproval by the Germans, but actually, the practical effect of it is exactly the opposite. The Germans had stayed in, and if they vetoed it, the Admirals and the great powers would not have been able to do the takeover of Crete, which they planned. They're only able to do it because the Germans withdraw. You don't see any Turkish sources saying that or blaming the Germans for that, but it's obviously the case. Otherwise, you have to go at the part of the slowest one. In February 1897, after those killings in Candia at the end of January that year, the Ottoman system breaks down. The insurgents are cash rich. The Greeks place an army on the island. It arrives outside Canea on the 15th of February. There's fighting all over the island, and on the east of it, There's a series of major massacres, which are one of the main themes of this talk, in which 1,000 Muslims die under very clear circumstances, apparently with the presence of officers from the Greek army travelling from village to village and arranging ethnic cleansing. Unable to control the situation, George Berovich, the last governor of Crete, Abdulhamid had reverted to having Christian governors in the summer of 1896, flees the island. He speaks Slavish. He rushes to the Russian boats in Canea harbour. And although there are further governors of Crete, Ottoman governors of Crete, they are not recognised by the great powers because they're not appointed under the terms of the international agreements. What is this like for the Cretan Muslims? These are words from an article I'm copying, the descendant of some Cretans who left the island in rather extraordinary circumstances in the summer of after the uprising in 1898. They left their home for the safety of Candia in 1896, the summer 2 years earlier. And you can see they hear blood flowing down, they see children being killed, so they panic and went. That red blood actually seemed like rain in the summer is a bit improbable. And I think you get something of the atmosphere from this quotation. And they blame Abdulhamid. I can't really speak modern Greek, but you can read it. Sultan Hamid Fasila, because of course they speak Greek. Halifi to profiti, then he lipse ti toka, kuchetis inkriti, pumiti ke legoti, ma idri borona kano, hende Vasilias te kunde, stingefalen apano. Hey, Sultan Ahmed, the Caliph of the Prophet, are you hurt or feeling pain to what's happening into the Turks in Crete? And he replies, what can I do if 5 kingdoms, that's the great powers, are stepping on my head, other than crying or screaming? That hasn't been published anywhere, so a small item of Cretan history. From the beginning of March 1897, the Admirals are beginning to become the real power in Canea. And this has a direct effect, and an unfortunate effect, on Biliotti. Because Admiral Robert Harris, who is a bluff, highly intelligent, very shrewd, very decent, very fair man, distrusts Levantines. Not the Levantines McCall distrusts. He distrusts Biliotti's Greek vice consuls. He refuses to give them the cipher. They can't read British secret documents on the assumption, probably correct, that they'll pass it on to their nationalist co-religionists. He also strongly dislikes Biliotti and cuts Biliotti off from the flow of British policy-making documents. This is the first reduction in Biliotti's power. It comes from a man who essentially on many topics agreed with him. It's quite interesting if you read the Admiralty papers, because Harris's dispatches are frequently blue-papered. All his stuff about the Levantine consuls being untrustworthy, heavily papered out, so that they don't get published in the blue box, which are freely available. It's one of the interesting things of this research, the bits that have been either hidden through blue pencils or actually pulled out of the record. It's just a picture of what Candia is now like under the cordon with the various things around it. And of course, there's an attempt to keep some sort of, the red circles with dots in them are the British posts. There's an attempt to keep some sort of contact between the two communities and to organise some sort of fair to enable trade. Effectively, the Muslims are being starved out. That's a picture of the international forces. It's quite a well-known picture. They may all be Austrians. You notice they're in special summer kit. It was so hot in Cyprus that they had to design new uniforms for them. That would enable them not to be too paralysed by the heat. Talking about fighting everywhere, and we'll come to the ones that particularly concern me. On about the 10th of February, 1897, the Greeks land here, and they march inland with field guns. And I have a sort of, through his son, an account of what it was like to be there when a boy called Jevdet Karahasanaki, only 10 years old, is attending a school in Daphne, a place which I visited, a very poor village in the mountains. Suddenly he hears the bangs. He didn't know what they were, when I heard the account from his son about a century later, I knew exactly what they were, their field guns. And he hides under a French grocer's store, and the grocer shelters several boys, and then they come out and they discover that all their relatives are dead. In fact, it's worse than that, because if you read the French accounts, the French, when they got there, found particularly specifically, definitely, there were about 15 other villages, all sorts of burnt houses with charred bodies still inside them. Mutilation is also a factor. Jevdet marches to the island. It's only about 30 miles, no, probably less than that, about 25 miles. There, at a place called Turtuli, now called Agios Iorios, he discovers his mother, father, and brothers, all mutilated, their genitals and their mouths, their breasts cut off. It's all horrible, but it's a sort of family memory. And he marches down to the coast. He and his friends are in luck, because HMS Tyne, a troop carrier, following the British lobbying about Muslim murders of Christians in Crete, is travelling along the island looking for victims, and they keep worrying back. We can't find any Christians who are victims, but we're hearing rumours that Muslims are being killed. Is that possible? And they hit a group of about 33 women and boys. I'm pretty sure that's Jevdet Kal-Hassanaki and his friends, and they take them back that night. It wouldn't take them very long, to Candia. They stay overnight there. An order is issued for them to be shipped out of the island. It's not signed by Harris, where Harris should be signing is blank. I'm pretty sure Harris knew about it. They go to Syra or Syros, and then Jevdet Kal-Hassanaki is whisked from Syros to Izmir, where he's put in an orphanage with Dar Leitam, and he grows up with lifelong memories of the family he lost. And by coincidence, I happened to know his son well. Meanwhile, the Greek army is trying to establish a presence on the island, I guess hoping that the great powers will cave in and agree with it, which they don't. They think the situation is extremely dangerous. There's a very graphic editorial in the Times warning Greece that if it goes on behaving like this, it will trigger a pan-European war in which huge numbers will die and various countries, presumably Austria-Hungary, will cease to exist. I mean, you say, did they know the First World was coming or not? Certainly, in February 1897, the Times realized what would happen if there were a major international conflict. Herding into enclaves of the Muslim continues. How is the situation going to be resolved? On the 24th of February, Biliotti proposes that the island be made autonomous, not under a Turkish or a Greek governor, but under a European. The man he has in mind is a Swiss man called Numa Droz. Totally neglected today. Droz eventually refuses the position because he's Swiss, doesn't like kings, and refuses to work for either the King of Greece or the Sultan of Turkey. So they have to look elsewhere. Meanwhile, Biliotti, who I'm only really dealing with a section of the very diverse consular activities and relief activities he had to do, decides to help relieve a group of Muslims in the south of the island. This is probably his most heroic moment. Reports of the Sitia massacres are coming through. They're graphically described in the dispatches. No one actually knows where Daphne is. And I, myself, the Ottoman government, Lysimachos Kalakarino, and myself all assumed it was a completely different town in the middle of the island, not where it actually is. It looked as if there's going to be a second major massacre, and Biliotti plucks up resolution and organises an international relief force, which involves sailing around the west coast of the army, and does it eventually, in an operation lasting nearly a week, save 2,047 Muslims that they have to abandon wounded women and children. That gives you some idea of what he's doing, which is at that day very difficult. You can't, of course, go straight down because you've got the Lefki Ori, the White Mountains in the middle of the island, which are impossible. So they have to sail right round, which they do, setting off at about 2 in the morning, go down to Palikora, and Mick has written an article on this, calling it the Battle of Palikora. They march inland, and they go up to Candanos, and they are under fire. but they managed to get the population out, march them back, put them on the boats, and get them to Canea. That's more than yet. Inland march on the country. Greece, of course, demands that the people who've been saved be sent to Athens. It's a mystery to me why, in such a remote part of Greece, of Cyprus, there should be a population of Muslims there. There must be something to do with the Vakuf, I think, a pious foundation. Not an obvious strategic point to situate Grecian people. They're obviously highly vulnerable. Meanwhile, battle and fighting is going on, involving both Ottomans and mainland Greeks around Candia. And these are battleships in which Biliotti and Harris both come under fire themselves and experience some dangerous moments. Having saved the Greeks of Candanos, Biliotti and others tried to investigate what happened in the east of the island. A naval commander, a naval officer called Mr. Penny, is sent with a group of people. Lysimachus Kairino apparently ensures that no Muslims are included in the party, only consists of Greek Christians. And here this shows you what they did. They march from Sitia down there, they march around here. They actually go to Turtuli, which I think is marked there. And everywhere they go, they find everything totally quiet. One or two Muslims, mostly old ladies. No one makes a single complaint, not a sign of a body anywhere. Well, the French 2 weeks earlier were definitely finding bodies. The French are completely unsympathetic, but they did find the bodies and they did report them. So the word goes back, encouraged by Kairinos, that the massacres have been disproved. Biliotti is completely embarrassed. He can only point out that various Christians behaved well, like Christians, and tried to save the murdered Muslims. Harris is scathing. He says they saw no bodies because the bodies had all been removed. The Muslims who survived were simply relatives of the local Christians. But anyhow, there's nothing that they can do about it. But of course, there are at least 800 witnesses to the murders now in Candia. They've been moved by the British in HMS Tyne later for their own safety to join the Muslim population huddled inside the walls of Candia. At more or less exactly this point, about 2 days later, the Admirals, who already regard Crete as de facto autonomous in law, on the basis of the arguments I mentioned earlier, declare an international blockade. A ring of steel goes around the island. The Ottomans can no longer send troops in. We managed to get a governor in. And the island is regarded as legally autonomous, which allows the Admirals to fix the law and the regulations, though they're by no means in control of the whole country, certainly not the hinterland, which is now entirely Greek-run. This happens fortuitously for the Greeks just before the Greco-Turkish War in Paris and Thessaly in April 1898, in which the Greeks are roundly defeated. Had it not been declared, the whole outcome of the Cretan crisis might have been completely different. Period begins, which is idyllic in much of Crete, because it is virtually anarchical, there's no government, people just engage in farming, and they're protected. There's no longer any intercommunal conflict. The Muslims have gone, they've been removed, while the Muslims are under siege, as I said, close to starvation. The Russians, French, and Italians, as Biliotti points out in his memoirs, in his dispatches, fraternize very closely, particularly in Retimo, with the Christians. The British, under Chermside, who've got a completely different situation because they have to deal with 52,000 angry Muslims, starving Muslims, work very hard to conciliate them. And of course, Chermside is a past master at this, worked in eastern Turkey, and being, I think it's fair to say, somewhat anti-Armenian in his general approach. He certainly found it very easy to deal with Muslims. These are the military zones. Now the Austrians there originally, you have Candia, Candia, which is an international zone, then you have the Russian zone at Retemo, the British zone at Candia, up there, and then finally the French zone in the poorest, the most beautiful part of the island, around Sitia. And the French have very little to do except deal with the aftermath of the massacres. The British get the short straw. They have a highly dangerous situation. Very little happens. How are we doing for time, by the way? Oh, not too badly. Yeah. Very little happens for the next year, so let's move forward. In the summer of 1898, the confederation of personalities and international politics is changing. Since none of the great powers are going to get anything out of this conflict, they're putting money into it, they all want it to end. Sir Robert Harris is constantly getting letters from his Admiral Hopkins in Gibraltar saying, how much longer is this going to go on for? You know, it's a great waste of resources. Can't understand why it's taking you so long. So in the summer of 1898, after the Austrians and the Germans have pulled out of the concert on Crete, the great powers resolve to react. There are various other factors why they do this. One of them being probably that Gabriel Hanotaux, the French foreign minister, falls from office in the 14th of June. He was strongly anti-British, quite pro the Sultan. He'd been a diplomat in Istanbul in 1885, the time of the Tophane Conference. He seems to be the monarchist. At one stage, he warned the Greeks that if they overthrew the monarchy and picked out King George, that might be the end of the state of Greece, which is an odd thing for the foreign minister of a republic to do. But the British and French are still facing a major crisis over Fashoda in Sudan. Nonetheless, the new French Foreign Minister, Théodore Delcasse, is considerably more friendly or pacific towards the British. I think the Salisbury government sees this as an opportunity. So the admirals are authorised to make contacts with the Greek Congress, with the Greek Assembly. They go to a place called Kakoris, and they make a deal which gives them control over the hinterland and promises a transition to Greek administrative rule in the cities. When this is happening, I mean, this is a very easy transition in Hania, certainly in Retimo, and of course in Sitia, where there are virtually no Muslims left. It's an extremely difficult one in Hania. Just at that point, Chermside has gone on holiday for the summer. He doesn't come back till the end of September. He leaves in May with greetings from the Muslim community. This is a two-edged sword because it makes him look very bad in the eyes of the humanitarian organisations, such as the Grosvenor House Committee, headed by Canon McCall in London. Roland Mannering calls for the Muslims to be allowed to return to their homes, poor little chappies. It's quite an astonishing dispatch, and Lord Salisbury, this gentleman, Sir Thomas Anderson, read it with astonishment. So the result of this is that there's an explosion. Biliotti warns against it. He visits Candia and tries to do a deal. He's dealing with an incompetent British commanding officer, but he's seen as a troublemaker by the Admirals. And they have decided to force the issue in Candia by sacking the remaining Muslim officials in the dime, people earning about £3 a month. And when Biliotti goes to Candia, he's met on his return by the angry admirals of Russia and Italy, who are very displeased with him. The general mood is against the Brits. Biliotti refers to a chasse contre les Anglais, and on the 6th of September, the Brits are ordered to take over the dime. Quickly, fighting breaks out. You can see the figures: 18 British soldiers killed, 300 to 500 Christians, most of the Christians at the time killed, including Consul Lysimachus Palikari Highlander and his family, burnt alive in their house, and about 41 Muslims, including some soldiers and some irregulars. This is an interesting event, and I think it's about the first person who can say it. The Brits at the time suspected that there had been a Muslim conspiracy. It's quite evident in their faces of what they say. Well, I can tell you now, and I think this is the first time it's actually been said, there was a Muslim conspiracy, and I know the descendants of the people who did it, and they were shipped out of Candia by the Ottoman government, and they're now living in a country other than Turkey. They weren't allowed to settle in Turkey. Unfortunately, oral history over about 3 generations is very shaky. But I know when I first heard this story, I instantly recognized that they were talking about the burning alive of Kalikorona. It was no accident. The Brits are extremely harsh in their response. Muslim houses are flattened. There are trials and hangings. 2 are sent to the International Commission, shot by the Italians. And Chermside and Biliotti are under huge personal stress, questions in Parliament. Biliotti, Chermside having to exculpate himself. Biliotti put aboard HMS Candia and more or less quarantined, totally stripped of the influence he's had until then. His situation is made worse because the Times reveals that he had always believed Muslims would have to leave the islands. He urges Chermside then to save his position, puts forward the idea that the Muslims could be disarmed. It was rather obvious, but he was definitely the first to do it. And it's swiftly done. By the 22nd of September, the Muslims have now handed over all their arms. So there has to be a deal. Unless they're protected by the powers, they're going to be slaughtered. And the Greeks say that, we will cut their throats. The Times comments disapprovingly. Next step is the final removal of all Ottoman officials and soldiers and troops from the island between the 1st and the 14th of November, ending a story which began in 1669. And there's Biliotti's boat, HMS Candia. Those who know your Victorian naval history will know that it was an ill-fated ship which had collided with another ship 4 or 5 years before. Very stormy weather. And to make things worse, Biliotti is under attack at the Grosvenor House Committee in London as an easygoing Levantine. It's not named, it's very clear who he is. Foreign Office says nothing to protect him, though it does rather shrewdly send a consul along to describe aid to the Levantines. But Biliotti is basically publicly disgraced and insulted. The suggestion is that he's doing what he's doing to please the Ottoman government because he's making money out of them. He's also on very bad terms with the Istanbul ambassador, Nicholas O'Brien, who writes him a series of extremely rude letters. And from being the most important person in Crete, he becomes more or less a non-entity for several months. But it's rather surprising, and by the way, coming to the end now, that in the last 2 months of 1898, as the handover of the island is prepared, Chermside and Biliotti go hammer and tongs to try and get Lord Salisbury to do something about the Sitia massacres. You can see the logic. The Ottomans are being dispossessed because they committed massacres. They're thought to have committed a wicked crime deserving of the most drastic punishment for murdering a maximum of 800 people, probably more like 500 or 600, including 38 British soldiers. Well, the other side had murdered at least 1,000 women and children under much less excusable circumstances. And so they seem to see it as a matter of honour to do something about it. They are both professional public servants. There have to be limits to what they can do. And at the same time, they also have an important role trying to persuade the Muslims not to leave the island, which they're doing in large numbers, which they think would mean perhaps, and helping reconstruction. An almost impossible task because you'd need trees and wood and timber to rebuild the Cretan houses. Not possible because you only have olive trees, basically, in Crete. So unless someone puts up the money to import the construction materials, which they don't, nothing can be done. No funding is provided. Meanwhile, on the 19th of November, as they're trying to break up the Muslim community in Candia, Admiral Poitiers, the French admiral, says the Sitia massacre survivors must return to the province. 40 of them go there, and they come back saying that the conditions are far too dangerous and they believe they'll be murdered. If you go to Sitia, people will tell you there were Muslims around until the final population exchange in 1923-24. So perhaps some did go back, but basically the idea, the region was de-Ottomanized and de-Muslimized. Places like Turtelli had their names changed, supposed to be Turkish. Noel, the second British command admiral, goes on the 1st of December, impressed by the French, gets on with them, and is probably reporting directly to Salisbury on this. So he supports the idea of forcing them to return. This leads Biliotti and Chermside to throw their last, from my point of view, most helpful shot. Chermside prepares a very long list of names, in which, to my astonishment, I found the Chasse and Anglais family, and I got the Kimlicks of some of the people who died in the 60s. so I can tell that names of mothers and things are identical. Identification is firm. I did have people challenging it, and they wanted a petition to Lord Salisbury to prosecute the organisers of the massacres, all of whom are known and named in the petition, and it's forwarded to Noel on the 6th of November. Salisbury reads it, he puts his characteristic S on the side, but it's the end of the story. He does nothing. The Admirals are now discussing the removal of Biliotti from the island. Biliotti and Chermside also bring up the issue of abducted Muslim children in Salino and Sitia, abducted in 1896 and 1897. What was this? We don't know. The documents are weeded. The weeders in the Foreign Office don't always do their job very well. And when Chermside is in his next post in Thessalonica, he writes about this and he gives them some details about the places where this happened and the numbers involved. There's nothing I can find in the Crete documents to explain what was happening. The British decided to draw a line under this, and Poitiers writes letters to Noel, and this is where Biliotti's networking comes in. Noel says, I ordered Biliotti to make the fuss. If you want to blame anyone, blame me. That's very nice of him, and Noel is not a very nice man. He's a very cold man. So the fact that he went to do that for Biliotti is rather interesting. And Poitiers writes back, well, I accept. And by now, Prince George has arrived from the mainland, second son of the King of Greece, the nephew of Princess, soon-to-be Queen Alexandra, and Crete leaves the Ottoman Empire, immense rejoicing among the French troops and the local Christian population, and well described by the Guardian journalist H.N. Brailsford in his book. He writes a very good account of what it was like to be in Candia the night of the handover. And Biliotti and Chermside are now on the wrong side of the lines, trying to do their work. I would emphasise that they're not pro-Muslim, they're just humanitarian neutrals, in my opinion. And of course, being opposed to a nationalist agenda makes you be demonised by the other side. Anyhow, the Greeks, and particularly George's advisors, make it clear that they don't want the consuls to have their former influence, and they want them out. And by the summer, he succeeded in getting them both out, despite relief work that was being done in the first half of 1899. The Royal Navy takes Billy out of the island on a warship which takes Salonika. Not to be outdone, the French do the same for Biliotti's brother-in-law, Paul Blanc. He also goes on a warship. The Salonika story is not a very happy one. Biliotti is old, he's not just deaf, he's losing his eyesight. It's a 4-way international conflict, and to handle it, he's getting £300 a year less. So his time there is rather sad. He retires in 1903, and he dies, well, he dies a British citizen, but he dies effectively an Italian citizen too, because Rhodes has been taken over by the Italians in October 1912. Lives to 1915 and dies in February that year, and is largely forgotten. Forgotten so much that 5 years later, when some British Foreign Office officials in the embassy in Athens are trying to get compensation for damage to his house in Canea, they write that he was a notable friend of the Greeks. I suspect the Greeks knew perfectly well that had not been the case, because King George was constantly lobbying against him. So too was Abdul Hamid. He didn't want Biliotti to go to Salonika, but he didn't have the power to stop it. The British royal family was rather more powerful. We find Princess Alexandra telling people that Biliotti is a terrible Turk. It is extremely unfair. Well, he survived. The Foreign Office stood by him to the extent he needed, and after many years of service, reached a comfortable retirement, speaking his own language. Was he right to make the fuss he did? Who knows? And there's a deeper question. Was the removal of the minority population in the area of conflict, idea which is totally anathema to modern ideas of diversity, actually a good idea? I can't answer that question, but I can tell you that some of the descendants of the Muslim Cretans living in Turkey would say yes. They think that actually separation did work. That's maybe because they're people from the Middle East. Well, thank you very much. I think I've overrun my time, so I'll stop.
Thank you very much indeed, David. That was fantastic, terrific, and raised all kinds of questions and threw a lot from the night for me. We've got time for a few questions. If you want to ask a question, wait for the roving mic to come to you, and then ask your question.
Could you say who you are, too?
Cornelia Navarra, University of Buckingham. Why didn't the British want the Turks to emigrate?
Well, the Greeks didn't want the Turks to emigrate, actually.
Yes,
the Greeks are much more sensitive to the way the Muslims feel than the British are. Prediction from introspection, I suspect. But they...
Sorry, the Greeks didn't want them to emigrate?
They didn't, not at that stage, no. Well, they thought it would lead to a collapse of the agricultural economy. They probably wanted them to go in due course. We're talking about Athens, by the way. I'm not talking about the Cretans themselves. But they thought that they were needed for the farming, or would be needed. Or maybe they were just being polite, I don't know. But the documents say quite clearly that they tried to resist it.
Could you wait for a second, please?
Philip Mansell, London University. You described two hostile populations, and they must have been cousins, in fact. Most of the families are related across the religious barrier, even if it was some way back. Was there no crossover? I mean, were there no Greeks helping Muslims or working together with them and vice versa?
Well, I mean, in the Kara Hasanaki case, this is a very nationalistic Turkish family now. But the fact of the matter is they owe their existence to a friendly Greek shopkeeper. No, there are plenty of... And also there are elopements of boys and girls and things of that sort, which Biliotti dutifully reports. I think the situation is very similar to Cyprus. But once knives are drawn and people are in fear of their lives, and in the massacres, for example, most of the people committing the massacres came from other areas of Crete, from Lassithi in the middle, and so forth. But yes, there was some, but it was a minority. Having said that, the person who's written most about the Sitia massacres from the Greek point of view is a man called Nikos Papadakis, who's now dead. And he's written some, to my mind, rather offensive things on the internet, saying that the murders were good. But to be fair to him, he has invited people I've talked to from the Turkish mainland, descendants of Cretans, over, and he told them what had happened. I was rather impressed by that. And they're still quite in close contact with him and his family. So yeah, there is a certain, in some moods, feeling of commonality.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes? Rob.
Rob Holland. Two brief things. One on Gordon. You said it was a mistake to establish a cordon. I suppose the thing is that Crete is such a kind of test bed for what happens with ethnic breakdown. And one might think that, in the immediate panic of such events, those who are somehow responsible have no option but to impose a cordon to prevent bloodshed. And you're right that over time that itself becomes a problem.
Yes.
But in the immediate instance,
Well, it was a...
it's preventing people being massacred.
You're right. Actually, when I said that, I'm actually quoting de la Martinière, who says that about...
So, I mean, you could go through to the date and accord in recent times. It's the same basic problem. And the other thing is simply about, not a question, but perhaps you could say more, this abducted children's story.
Well,
So what's the possibility in this horrible event on 6th of September 1898, and you say about the Calacrino family being burnt to death in their home, there was this thing that perhaps the daughter had been saved.
yeah, but I think that's a myth.
But sort of, perhaps the people, that every Muslim woman who left,
You always had her face, yes. Yes.
checked to say, was she carrying possibly a Christian baby, this daughter? And later there was the rumour that perhaps she had been taken to Salonika. And when Biliotti was there later on, that was one investigation that was made, whether the Calacrino daughter was still alive.
Yeah, I think
unlikely,
yeah.
but it's an interesting...
It's an interesting idea. I don't believe... I'll look back in my notes because I've read the Thessalonica papers. But, I mean, I don't think that was ever thought to be very much of a likelihood, whereas the Selino and Sitia things are definitely the case. And unfortunately, we can't know very much about them because the papers have been removed.
I should preface the question by saying that David knows that I'm working on the life of Biliotti's predecessor, immediate predecessor in Crete, as my neighbour does here, but nobody else does. Can I just take you up on one theme? You use the word Levantine, and Philip Mansell has already left, but he knows more about it than anybody. Ever since the Foreign Office took over responsibility for consular service from the Levant Company in 1825, showing British and Foreign Office in particular concern about loyalty and competence of Levantines and their eagerness to promote into the consular service real Englishmen, and of course by Englishmen they meant people from some part of the British Isles as well. Can you say how far you think that there was prejudice had deep roots of that kind, as distinct from roots that were related to his immediate activities? Because Sandwith, his predecessor, was absolutely classically the non-Levantine. He was the upper middle class, Cambridge-educated kind of consul that the Foreign Office were trying to attract.
Yeah, well, if you read David Hogarth in his splendid books, The Accidents of an Antiquarian's Life and The Wandering Scholar, you'll see that he and almost all the other people who came into close contact with Biliotti thought it a paradox. Here's this man who's not got a drop of British blood in his veins, but he's a very patriotic servant of Britain, the most loyal servant. So I don't think that is felt by most people. It's felt by people to remove by the sort of younger diplomats in the British Embassy in Constantinople and by motivated people in London. But then, what do you mean by Levantine? Because the sub-consuls, the vice-consuls, Triphilis, Casimati, and Kalokorino, they're Ionian Greeks, some of them with British nationality, and they're doing precisely the things that McCall complains of, although they're actually on the side that McCall is supporting. I think the whole word of Levantine is a bit of a thing. I mean, it's only a 100-year episode in the history of a family going back to the 1300s, which is when the Biliottis began in Lucca. And after, I didn't really have time to describe it, but Biliotti dies in Crete. He has a son who's in his 20s, and I've done my research, this is uniquely, on Skype. And I've tracked down the living Alfredo Biliottis in Italy and the Italian part of Switzerland today, who are descended from him. And the family just goes back to being a standard, venerable Italian family. There's nothing genuinely or intrinsically Levantine about them.
And I think probably our last one, yeah.
In doing your research, have you looked at any Turkish archives?
Yeah, I've looked at some of the Turkish Foreign Ministry archives, but the thing about diplomatic correspondence is it's depressingly congruent. What you read in French in the Turkish archives is more or less what you've read in English in the British archives. I would like to read the French, and if I could, the Russian archives. I think I get a much more interesting. French archives are very, the Livre Jaune, the published ones, are very stylized. And I would love to read the Greek archives, which have been published in some cases for earlier stages of Greek history, presumably edited. But I think they'd be very important, because the Greek consul was, of course, Gennadius, was Biliotti's greatest opponent. And he was the one who was feeding King George, who was feeding McCall, who was feeding Gladstone and Lord Salisbury against him.
Well, please come and join us for a drink afterwards. But first, do join me in thanking David for a really wonderful evening. It's been a wonderful evening.